consider each and everyone tuned into the special exclusive of the ANC Youth League, led by the ANC Youth League, involving youth formations locally and internationally, to reflect upon the post-State of the Nation address for 2023. It's a precarious time in the global economic climate, and the local context in South Africa is certainly no exception. This afternoon, the ANC Youth League Economic Development Subcommittee extends its affirmation to peers from the ANC Youth League, from SASCO, from COSAS, from the Young Communist League South Africa, from the Young Women's Desk of the ANC Women's League, and from broader civic society sectors to say that our future cannot be for us without us. There are many strategic decisions that need to be made and interventions that need to be made to ensure that the South African economy steers far away from an economic recession. And in no uncertain terms, it is the view of the ANC Youth League that it is the responsibility of the ruling party, the African National Congress, to ensure that that does not happen. As we well know, or as you may know now as a result of this engagement, the State of the Nation address was delivered just about a week ago. In fact, exactly a week ago. Since then, political parties across the country had gathered to make their reflections around what is agreeable and what is disagreeable. What is clear in our view is that there needs to be tensions in reasoning that needs to be reconciled. And it is our view that a significant part of that leadership responsibility is listening and discerning decisively between what are the quick wins, what are the wins that need to be prioritized in the medium term to ensure that the fiscal strain on the purse of the South African economy can be lessened. The proportionality of the populace of this country sees that social welfare is a significant factor that cannot be wished away. And to ensure that the developmental agenda of South Africa doesn't push from the center to the periphery, we hope that the reflections this evening will highlight some of the economic development interventions that can ensure that the foreseeable future of South Africa is bright. And bright, no pun intended, but bright in the sense that the crises that we are seeing, principles of power in our South African context, keep ushering in a national crisis or state of disaster. And in as much as circumstances sometimes require that such difficult decisions need to be announced, it cannot be tolerated with a passive outlook that we be remembered as a political party that ushered in only a national crisis upon national crises. And so we challenge every single attendee here this evening to share what in their view is a quick win that could ensure the kind of cross-sectoral engagement that can bring about the kind of synergy and possibly unprecedented synergy to ensure that we not only avoid an economic recession, but we begin building the kind of foresight and proactive planning to ensure that our fiscus is improved upon, our state debt or our country's national debt is managed more effectively, and so that we can move from this ever increasingly and deepening deficit into something that is more positive than just that. I'm trying to summarize a much lengthier reflection, which I'll take the advantage of towards the end of this evening's reflections, being mindful of load shedding and data costing in South Africa, as not everyone participating is currently connected to Wi-Fi. We are going to be as brief as possible. And to ensure that we do just that, I thought I'd rely on one of the ANC Youth League National Economic Development Subcommittee members to moderate the session, as I can be extraordinarily nice and overly tolerant from time to time. But I trust that Comrade Kamil Ali, who is an ANC Youth League Gauteng Provincial Task Team member, who also heads up the disciplinary committee of the ANC Youth League in that province, would do a perfect and stellar job at that. Comrade Kamil Ali is not only an ANC Youth League Gauteng Provincial Task Team member, he is also a former ANC Youth League Ward 82 Branch Secretary and also a former ANC Ward 82 BEC member. and he is an incumbent, a working casting member in Ward 82. So, Comrade Kamil, shukran, terima kasih, baie dankie for sparing a moment of your time this afternoon. Over to you, Comrade.
Comrade INCYL, who have joined us both on the Zoom platforms as well. I hope to do justice to this evening's proceedings, but I just like, if you are not currently speaking, kindly mute yourself and also turn off your video, just to assist the issue of data and data costs for those who are using that as well. I'm told that my network connection isn't great. I apologize for that. I will try my best to try and fix it and sort it out. So we were initially meant to start with a member of the ANC, an NEC member, but unfortunately we haven't had a representative yet. So we're going to start off this evening with Comrade Fasea Hassan. But just before we get there, the State of the Nation address is really an opportunity for government to outline its priorities for the coming year. You know, South Africa in the past year faced many issues. You know, the high rates of unemployment, and particularly youth unemployment, the natural disasters that we're seeing as a result of climate change. All of these have had a huge impact on the economic standing of our country. So to take us off this evening, we have Comrade Fasea Hassan, who is an ANC Youth League, NYTT and NWC member. She's also a member of the provincial legislature in Gauteng and a former chairperson of the economic development, the portfolio committee on economic development in the province. Over to you, Comrade Fasea. I'm going to be timing you. You've got about 7 minutes. So.
No, thanks, Comrade Kamil. Let me send my revolutionary greetings to everybody who's online. I think Comrade INCYL has already covered the stuff around access, and we know that it is, of course, not an easy time to host a virtual event given the load shedding, giving access to data, but we did feel that it's important as a youth league to have some commentary post-SONA, because it moves beyond statements, and it needs to move beyond the sort of intangible elements and really move to something more important. So I am actually replacing Comrade Sizzo, who is our spokesperson for this evening, for the Youth League. And this evening I'll be replacing her. So she sends her apologies, and I'm going to do my best to speak to some of the things she wanted to speak to, and also some of the things that we're working on within the Youth League, and ultimately where we think we as a country need to be moving towards. So hopefully I'll be within the time limit. So the first thing that's very important for comrades who are watching this, who are just young people in the country or even just analysts, is that the Youth League will always be guided by its 7 cardinal pillars towards economic transformation, towards that economic freedom. And one of those pillars, of course, is around land, which I'll be speaking to, but fundamentally, all of those pillars feed into the economic element, which was a huge focus of the president this particular SONA. But I'll also be covering a little bit stuff on energy, a little bit of things on young people in SMMEs, sort of 4th IR and development, if there's time. But ultimately, focusing on the Youth League position on some of those things that can be found from our representations at National Conference and National Policy Conference, in which we presented a very, very strong and radical view of the current crisis. And the first is we must deal with youth unemployment. The first is that we would love, or we would have advocated for, a national state of crisis to be elevated of those issues. And that was something that we continue to push even now. But let's look at what SONA sort of covered and why we think that could work or couldn't work. And I thought that's a little bit of a better way to move beyond the rhetoric of what often happens at these sorts of panels. So we know that the president spoke to the Department of Small Business, working with National Treasury, so finding more support for youth-owned SMEs, all of that red tape reduction. He talked about making it easier to start off businesses. But one of the big things is the skills fund. Number one needs to be linked to this. But number two, there's a huge thing around the different types of SMME funding. And by and large, we're getting a lot of young people who are saying they're applying, but it's not really coming through. But also the kinds of application processes. And perhaps one of the things that needs to be put forward that I think we as the Youth League also need to be fighting for is very, very specific interventions for young people. So of course we want SMME support, but there should be a specific fund or even a sub part of that fund that's in existence already that's really put forward for young people. That's one option. Another option moves to the employment tax incentive. That's something where government says to businesses, we're trying to incentivize you. We're trying to say you should hire young people. If you do, we'll give you a tax break. It hasn't been as effective as we'd want it to be, and we must be honest on this platform about it. Too often businesses are claiming that employment youth tax incentive on already existing young people in their businesses. So they're not necessarily employing new young people. So that's something that's sort of easily solvable by one or two regulations that says, well, we want new young people to be claimed on. But of course, we need to put in safeguards and measures to prevent the existing youth from being kicked out and saying, well, we'll just have a new cohort every year. So that's something that we really need to look at, or an opportunity for the Youth League perspective there. In terms of the red tape reduction, we keep hearing about this. We need more specific interventions in terms of a list of things. We also need government to do a lot more work in terms of saying to young people in this country, this is how you start a business. Step 1, 2, 3, 4. And I think that's something in which the Youth League can also be pushing, because it's something where you keep hearing about all this red tape reduction. It's easier to start a business. Is it really? Because the reality, the kinds of discussions we've had with young people, is that it's still not accessible. It takes an extremely long time to hear back from these governmental agencies. And so often our youth-owned businesses close before we even get to a point where we can fund them. So that's quite important as well. Before I get to the matter of energy, I just want to cover more elements around youth unemployment. Right, so there's the National Youth Service, the Presidential Employment Stimulus, Social Employment Fund. The point is, hundreds of thousands of young people are meant to have been benefiting from these programs. But very importantly, we need to move beyond an EPWP concept. We need to move beyond short-term opportunities. So what we don't want, and so many young people have voiced this, and we as the Youth League have cried out against this, about this idea of very 1-2 little interim things all the time that don't really add up to much, number one. Number two, are not viable. Number three, are not sustainable. So you can go through 3 or 4 EPWP programs and then still not have anything to speak of on the other side. And that's why I mentioned earlier the link to the skills fund, the link to the skills development element, but beyond that, creating sustainable job opportunities. And ultimately, it's beyond just the idea of skills. The idea is that we as young people, our agency so often is taken away from us, whether it's by the economic crisis, whether it's by ageism, whether it's by how people think things need to happen because we are young. And I think a big part of the approach needs to be reinvigorating and giving our agency back to us as young people so that we're less reliant ultimately in the long run on a lot of these programs, but you have structural interventions that make it easier to access education, that make it easier to open a business, but also make it easier for both the private and the public sector to create more jobs that can be allocated to young people. On the issue of land, we cannot have a discussion without it. It's also one of our big elements that the Youth League has always spoken to and always advocated for. Of course, one would speak to a fast tracking of land, but also productive land. We want land in which young people can not just toil the soil, so to speak, but something that productive can come from. And that again links to everything that I've said, whether you're looking at an agricultural perspective, sure, but I think that's a very reductionist way of looking at land. Land is linked to dignity. And that is also around identity of the self. It's also around what we're doing as South Africans. It's also an economic opportunity. And that's something I think currently in South we could even have a whole panel about, dealing with land and the various elements and the various ideas around access to it and making it productive. I also want to speak to energy because that was a very big thing that the president spoke to in SONA, and I think the Youth League must have its views clarified and have our views out there. We know the president spoke to a new minister in energy, a state of disaster, etc. And so often we are being pegged as being anti-coal, anti-just transition, anti all of these things. And I think it's very important to say that by no means is the Youth League advocating for an end to coal completely. We understand that there's going to be a huge knock-on effect in terms of unemployment, but more importantly, there is a big gap in the energy generation system. I'm about to also get load shed. That's also why we're speaking earlier on in the program. And there's a big opportunity for green energy to supplement what is not provided for by coal. And why is this important for us as the Youth League? Why is this important for us as young people? Huge opportunities for us. These are new skills in the economy. These are skills that we can, as a competitive edge, as a generational group, cultivate, number one. But number two, all of these different incentives that have now been announced, the tax incentive for rooftop solar, the rolling out for low-income households, who's going to be rolling out that solar installation? Who has the skill set to maintain it? Who is the engineer on those projects? So when you look at the supply chain of green energy, there are huge opportunities for young people and huge opportunities for us to take it to the next level. So this is an industry that requires, yes, work, but also could be a big, big space for us as young people and as the Youth League to lead the charge, lead the narrative, and employ millions of young people across the different levels of supply chain. So from the person who's carrying the solar panel to the person who's designed the solar panel to the person who's maintaining it. And this should really be a focus in our township communities, in our lower income communities, because we know so many people have access to solar, those who have financial means, but we know that the working class doesn't. And I know I have to quickly finish, but I think, let me just conclude with saying this. I didn't cover everything, but I think eventually it will all come up. We need to build beyond the crisis. And the Youth League must be at the forefront of building beyond that crisis. We can't run away from it. We must address unemployment, energy, crime, GBV, etc. But we have to be the ones who plant the seeds for the future and for the now, because the older generation, unfortunately, seem unable to take us to that next level. And it must be us as the Youth League who takes on a more radical view, who's more clear and who's more sharp on the implementation of a number of different things. But hopefully in the later engagements, I'll be able to cover what I couldn't. Thank you to yourself, Program Director, and to everybody who's online and tuning in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Comrade Fasia, and thank you for sticking to time. As we do have quite a few more people to get through, I do really appreciate the input that you've given. Specificity around interventions for young people, I think it's very important, young women as well. And to take us through that, we have Comrade Sarah Mukwebo, who is here today representing the ANC Women's League Young Women's Desk. Is a youth leaguer who hails from the 10th province of Ekurhuleni. If you would like to please take us through to the next point in our discussion. Thanks.
Sorry, comrades, please just give me a few seconds. I'm load shed, so I'm just going to try to find a spot with a good network connection. So please just give me a few seconds.
Noted, leadership. Thank you.
Okay. I hope everyone can hear me and see me as well. Good evening, comrades, and I hope compatriots as well. As I've been introduced briefly by Comrade Camille, my name is Comrade Sarah, and I am a member of the ANC Women's League Young Women's Desk, and I speak in that particular capacity today. I wear a lot of hats, more especially in the ANC, but today is just on the desk. So reflecting on SONA as a young woman, and more especially of the ANC Women's League, one thing that we feel that not necessarily lacked, but how do I put this? So there tends to be wanting to analyze or interpret or want to come up with solutions for gender-based violence without actually appreciating the fact that gender-based violence often is a byproduct or is a result of whatever it is that could be happening around us as an organization or as a society. And I want to use the energy crisis as an example, and COVID-19 and all sorts of things. So many a times, whenever there is a crisis in society, whether it's an economic crisis or perhaps a political crisis or whatever it is, domestic violence, more especially, or violence against women and children tends to be on the rise. And reasons for that could be because of frustration, could be because of a whole lot of things. So there tends to be then of wanting to come up with solutions for these particular challenges without actually recognizing the fact that these challenges that we have are a product of what would be taking place in society. So with the energy crisis, for example, to give a very granular and simplistic example is that say you're a husband and because of patriarchy, sexism and all sorts of things, you are the one who's most likely to be employed compared to your wife. You come home and then your wife didn't cook, and the reason they didn't cook or make you food is because there was no electricity. Gender-based violence or domestic violence becomes on the rise because of that, because as a man, you are obviously going to question your spouse to say that, why is it that you didn't cook when I've gone to work and all sorts of things, blah, 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 blah. And with COVID-19 as well, because we were all under lockdown and everyone else was locked inside their homes and they could not necessarily either have access to assistance in the form of police assistance, or even to just get out of a setting with someone whom perhaps you would have been in conflict with, which conflict is a healthy thing, by the way, which doesn't always have to be violent. You'll find that now women are locked up in those particular situations or particular settings or contexts with their partners that are most likely going to abuse them out of frustration. So the State of Nation address in wanting to speak on the issue of gender-based violence, it sort of removed it from the context within which it always happens, things that always trigger gender-based violence and all sorts of things. Because, and as much as, for instance, you are going to allow women to be economically active and all sorts of things, that is not the end all and be all of gender-based violence. There's a whole lot of things that also contribute to it, from sexist views and all sorts of things, and that is one thing that just has to be like collective effort in eradicating. But the one thing that we can then also applaud about what the president has done or government has done, which because SONA is not only about what they are going to do, but it's also report back about what they would have done in the past year, is on the passing of 3 legislations that relate to gender-based violence or respond to gender-based violence. And these 3 legislations are, if you may just give me a second, because I feel it's important to mention them. Please just give me a second. Everything is on my phone. I am that generation. In retrospect, I'm thinking that I should have written other things down. So so these pieces of legislation are Criminal Law Amendment Act, the Criminal Related Matters Amendment Act, as well as the Domestic Violence Amendment Act. So these acts respond to domestic violence. And another important point or important note to make is with regards to the National Strategic Framework that is a result of the presidential gender-based violence summit, which from that National Strategic Framework, 5 pillars were come up with. 5 pillars were come up with in terms of how to respond to gender-based violence. And one of the many things for me, which I think this country needs to really go back in doing, is on advocacy work. Advocacy work is the reason South Africa was so successful in being able to curb HIV at the times that it did. Advocacy work we did as well see how it played a huge role in wanting to curb the spread of COVID-19 during the peak of the pandemic. And I think in wanting to address more especially the issue of gender-based violence, we also need to go back to that, because we still have a whole lot of people that hold the view that violence in relationships or unhealthy conflict or unhealthy ways of resolving conflict is as a result of love, and that is a norm and all sorts of things. And this advocacy work also needs to be something that applies as well to police officers, for instance, because there are people that are of the view that, for instance, you are obligated or you have to ask a woman out. Even in the instance where a person is just going to be in case with the police, you do find yourself being catcalled, you do find yourself being asked out, you do find yourself being made passes against or passes on by police. So the national strategic framework on GBV does have that pillar that speaks on advocacy work. And one of the many ways as well that we saw advocacy work, which would be something that, for instance, the Department of Communications would have to take up, is bringing back educative TV shows. You would remember during the times of Soul City, the times of Heartlines, the times of Home Affairs, etc., 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 etc. So this is something South Africans would remember or recall. I know I'm being a bit exclusionary in the examples that I'm citing, but South Africa for the longest times in the 2000s had a lot of educative TV shows, and at peak times, which would also allow kids as well to learn from how things are supposed to be, how the world order is, and all sorts of things. So I want to just focus specifically on that point of GBV to say that there seems to be a lack of understanding that GBV is a result of things that are happening around us, and it's not something that really happens in silo. So whenever we need to think of a decision, or whenever we have a crisis, or whatever it is that is taking place, we need to also then say, how does this trigger domestic violence, and what kind of mitigating ways can we come up with as a country, as a government, as a society, as a political organization, as the Youth League, in order to curb or to mitigate against the crisis that might arise as a result of that. And another thing that I feel the State of the Nation address was a bit silent on, but obviously it was due to the pressing issues that we have, is on the issue of how do we as a country respond to climate change and the disaster that is a result of climate change, because there also has the generally is a tendency to conflate just energy transition with responses to disasters due to climate change. So we need to also then be a people that start, and the best person to give a direction of that is the president, to say, how do we now move forward? Because the trends that are now happening, or trends that are now taking place in our country, is that there now seems to be a parallel between responding to disaster management as well as governance. So now our governance is not only going to be about eradicating poverty, inequality, and all sorts of things. Governance is also going to be highly informed about how it responds to disasters, which in turn has an effect on people's livelihoods, their quality of life, and all sorts of things. So that's another thing, perhaps, the State of the Nation address should have been very explicit on, to say, in this era of disaster that we have, and taking in mind that we're also trying to mitigate against it through energy transition, just energy transition, which, by the way, also just energy transition does not guarantee energy safety, or not even energy safety, but rather energy security. So those are some of the conversations that we need to internalize and understand, that just because we are a country that is now progressing towards JET, or just energy transition, doesn't necessarily translate to energy security. So we also need to then say, how do we also localize this just energy transition to ensure that there is energy security? And some of the examples Comrade Fasia actually did give about that. So my two or maybe 3 points would be on that. That one, whenever government comes up with a plan, more especially amid a crisis, we need to be a people that analyze and say, as I conclude, we need to be a people that then say, look at our surroundings and say, how does this trigger gender-based violence, and how best can we respond to prevent and also mitigate against it? Thank you very much.
No, thank you so much, Comrade Sarah. Some keen insights. Specifically around the legal framework that's been developed to combat gender-based violence. And I think there's a message on the group that on the chat, that I saw, that says we always speak of GBV, but we don't have an actual scientific solution to it. And I think it's quite an important step towards finding that solution, is to build a legal framework where we can hold men of our society accountable for the way that we behave as men. So without taking up too much more time, we have a representative from the glorious student movement, the South African Student Congress, Comrade ANCYL NYTT. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correct, Leadership, who is the Deputy Secretary General of SASCO. Over to you, Leadership, to take us through.
Thank you very much, Comrade Chair of the session. Yes, you are partly right. The name is ANCYL NYTT. So thank you very much, and also greeting to fellow panelists and everyone who is joining us here. Thank you, comrades. Comrades, we think for the most part, the President must have mentioned really two things as it pertains to the sector. The first one was around expanding access to TVET colleges. And the second one obviously would be around the comprehensive student funding model, which I'll speak into. Around the issue of TVET colleges, we think it's absolutely critical. We are hoping that we are going to see more deliberate plans or action-orientated plans from various, firstly from the budget and also from the Department of Higher Education, that suggested that there is in fact a deliberate plan to expand access into TVETs. This is absolutely critical, we believe, as SASCO, in terms of, for many things. The first one, in terms of the socio-economic development goals of the country, we believe that TVETs will play a central role in that. And also in terms of job creation, TVETs are absolutely critical in that area. So I think the case has been made around the importance of expanding that particular sector, giving it the necessary support that it needs. It's actually quite interesting that the sector is consisting of less than 500,000 students as compared to the university sector that consists of more than 1 million students. And yet, when you look at the NDP goals, it should be the other way around in terms of the targets that you're trying to meet in terms of growing the TVET sector. So I think that is something that we really need to go beyond rhetoric and grow as the African National Congress government. And then as it pertains to the issue of funding, I suppose we must note and acknowledge the fact that the president acknowledged the plight of the missing middle students in his SONA through alluding to the comprehensive funding model. Now, for those of us who might not necessarily be aware, the Department of Higher Education had about a year or two back commissioned a ministerial task team to investigate around the possibilities to be able to address the plight of missing middle students. The South African Student Congress would have obviously contributed to that. And it came back towards the end of last year. And there were a few recommendations which we believe are critical in terms of dealing with the plight of missing middle students. These students are the students, in fact, right now they make up more or less about 23% of the total sector. So it's a huge number of students that are in the sector that do not have funding. And the students, based on that, by the way, their debt has ballooned to from just between 2017 and now, from around 11 billion rand to 16.5 billion rand. Now, unless government has a plan to deal with the issue of the missing middle, it is actually going to undermine the financial integrity of our institutions, in particular our HDIs, because if you look at that 16.5 billion rand, about 70% of that, 70 to 80% of that debt belongs to HDIs. It is not from your previously white institutions. And this is why those institutions are on the brink of collapse. And in fact, some of them have even been placed under administration. And these are the universities that are catering and that are, in most cases, even closer to our communities, that cater for the poor and the working class. So we are really concerned about that, unless we're able to deal with that. And we're hoping that a cabinet will conclude between now and June and the recommendations of that MTT report. Just to share with the comrades here, one of the recommendations which we had made to that MTT report, cognizant of the fiscal challenges the country that is facing, was that that cap be increased for state funding from 350,000 to 600,000. But we appreciate it might not necessarily be 600,000, but it has to be increased. And we believe by addressing that, we will reduce the aggregate size of the missing middle. And then as it pertains to another recommendation, it were government-backed loans that students that they can be able to get from banks backed up by government, so that they are able to, one, for those that will fall outside the bracket, but also for postgraduate students. It is impossible to build an innovative developmental state, in fact, a developmental state informed by research and innovation, without investing in research and development through investing in postgraduate students. And the reality of the matter is that the funding for postgraduate students in the last 3-4 years has probably been cut almost or more than by 50%, and that is unsustainable, because we are probably at that point. But the bottom line is that we probably need to invest heavily in postgraduate studies and building new systems of knowledge to be able to respond to the socio-economic needs of South Africa. And then the second to last point, Comrade Chair, not knowing how much time I have, is that the other question is around, we think that the state of the nation could deal with, but generally government needs to begin to deal with this issue, is the role of institutions of higher learning in responding to the socio-economic needs of South Africa. Right now, there are two big incongruences. The first one is that the output from basic education is actually incongruent with the demands of the higher education sector on two levels. The first one is that obviously we saw now we had almost 800,000 students that qualified, in fact, to enter institutions of higher learning. Not that all of them would have wanted to, but the spaces that we had in the sector to accommodate those students was probably less than 200,000. So that tells us that we are having a crisis in terms of one, capacity. The second one is that the majority of the candidates that we are releasing from basic education to higher education are in effect not in the doing the subjects that we would need to be able to put them in the scarce skills program for a rapid economic growth in South Africa. So that those are two areas that we need to speak to. What is the point of investing 164 billion rand in a sector, but we are not able to derive or able to determine what is the derivable benefit of that investment which we are making, based on the fact that the people, what we are in, the product that we are investing in is in fact not necessarily the best product to be able to respond to the socio-economic needs of South Africa. Not only economically, we say also socially. Take, for instance, the GBV.
As you conclude, Comrade,
as I conclude, funny enough, my last point on the issue of GBV, you take GBV as an instance. The reality is that our students, as they are entering the sector and they exit the sector, they are not armed, and the sector has not been able to say, how do we use our institutions of higher learning, research, development, and all these things to aggressively respond to the issues of GBV scientifically, number one. Number two is the issue of saying 10% of all GBV cases in South Africa occur within institutions of higher learning. Now, South Africa, with a population of around about 60 million people, we've got less than 1.5 million people in the sector alone, and yet 10% of the GBV cases are. So we believe that institutions of higher learning should be primary places of struggle or sites of struggle to deal with the issue of GBV, and the president would probably, the government at large, need to deal with it at that level and identify it as a specific deliberate site of struggle for dealing with the issues of GBV. Thank you very much, Comrade Chair.
Thank you very much, DSG. I'm always quite enthusiastic when SASCO comes in and making representation to the MTT. Continue with the good work, DSG. We are fully behind you and support you in the sector. Our next speaker is Comrade ANCYL NYTT, who is the first. They will be here to give us analysis from Marx and Lenin. Over to you, Comrade ANCYL. Okay, I'm not sure that I see Comrade on the call. Is there a representative from the YCL on the call? Okay, if not, then we'll move on. Should Comrade Yeti join in a bit later, we'll give him the opportunity to give his input. Activist, Dr. Lusapo Zwane. I'm going to hand over straight to you, Doctor, to give us.
Hello, I'm not sure if I'm clear. Literally just got out of load shedding, but I hope that I am audible.
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. My name is Lusando Ogwazwane. I am from KZN and I am a social activist. Just a very brief input I'm going to be making today, mainly based on the topic that I was given of economic development opportunities to assist in developing high road strategies for South Africa, reflecting partly on the State of the Nation address that was delivered by the president a week ago. A week ago exactly, the president took us into confidence about the state of the nation, and he earmarked specific challenges and gave the plans in place that government has put in place to address these challenges, as well as for further development and investment in the country. A lot of this is largely a continuation from the State of the Nation address of last year, 2022. Now, my understanding when we speak of high road strategies is these three pillars towards economic development, namely the development of high quality jobs, environmental sustainability, and broad access to opportunities for diversity in businesses, as well as for workers, as well as for citizens. It speaks about developing strategies towards an equitable, sustainable, as well as a democratic society. Again, this year, President reflected on social compact as a pillar, or rather as a strategy towards the economic reconstruction and recovery plan. SONA 2022 at the time reflected on the fact that within 100 days, it would work at establishing the social compact. A year later, President then reflects to us that unfortunately, this has not been the case. To some ends, there have been things that have been met in terms of establishing the social compact. I think we are all aware of the Solidarity Fund, but largely as it stands, there are many gaps that have led to not being able to completing this target. Now, when you look at a target or a strategy like social compact as a means to an end for this economic reconstruction and recovery plan, it looks at various stakeholder involvement to address certain issues, which are prominent issues which come up again time and time again in terms of how they affect the livelihood of South Africans. The first one at the time was overcoming COVID-19. As a healthcare professional, I think reflecting on this, the response of government to COVID-19, which was at the time a novel virus, has shown that government does have the capacity as well as the capability to be able to respond to emergencies in a meaningful way. When we look at the burden of disease, particularly now as opposed to March 2020, when the country went into its very first hard lockdown, there's a huge change and there's a huge shift. And the same energy applied to all areas of our economy, to all areas of the livelihood of South Africans, does show that there is a capacity if the will is there to get things done. Another thing that the social compact spoke about addressing is the rollout of infrastructure. For me, what I kind of zeroed into tying back to these developing high road strategies for economic development was telecommunications as a huge success, I would say, in terms of structure being developed and the rollout of infrastructure. I mean, we were all aware about the buzzword of migrating from analog to digital, and essentially what this means for the rollout of 5G mobile network, as well as the decrease of costs and data, which have become such a barrier, I mean, to even programs like this being able to happen effectively. So government being able to speak to things like that and being able to update us that this year they're in the final stages of completely switching off analog transmission, and the implications that it then has for society and the economy and our ability to interact in a digital world is important. That social compact also spoke to an increase in local production. Sorry, it also finally, the fourth point that it spoke to was an employment stimulus to create jobs and support livelihoods. Again, I did address this a bit earlier when speaking about the impact of the Solidarity Fund in creating job opportunities. Now, the ANC Youth League did reflect on this, and this is an important point to raise, is that the opportunities that are created ought to be accessible to young people, and they ought to be accessible to South Africans in general. It's a bit of an oxymoron when you have a situation whereby the post office is retrenching workers, post office facilities are not working, but the manner in which to apply for government work is through posting your applications. And these things kind of show a disconnect between what government, the good ideas that government has, and how they undercut their own good ideas through implementation. Also, a part of things that, sorry about that, my mom is calling me. A part of the things that the social compact speaks to has to tie in again with the topic of developing high road strategies. And a part of the things that's to is high quality jobs. You know, the government has reflected again in this SONA that it has established this National Skills Fund, that it has increased the TVET intake, which SASCO has reflected upon, and that they're hoping that to increase their targets even further, particularly going forward in 2023 from 10,000 intake to 20,000 in intake. So we're hoping that, or what it seems to appear like, is that government is now beginning to have a consensus in the fact that all these different ministries and all these different departments have to work together, and they actually have to work in cohesion to achieve a certain goal, and they can't pull in different directions. And finally, what Social Compact spoke to was the expansion, the rapid expansion it was, of an energy generating capacity. And I think this has come up as the biggest point, particularly of SONA, and it has come up as the biggest point of, or the bone of contention when it comes to challenges of the ANC government responding to the energy crisis in a manner that's meaningful, in a manner that's sustainable. Now, where do we fit in, and what role do we play? The first role that we have to play as young people is particularly being active citizens, partaking in the opportunities presented to us, but also interrogating the opportunities that government says that they are placing forth. When they speak of this transition and this green economy, how do we locate ourselves in this green economy, and what meaning does it have to us? The Department of, sorry, for the life of me, I can't remember which department it was now, but in Gauteng, spoke to a whole campaign, which I really loved. I think they'd called it Bastrata, that spoke to building a small economy around recycling, you know, and that kind of ties together this idea that the sustainable development goals, as well as environmental sustainability, can be a means in which we generate income. The biggest thing that has become glaring now is that youth unemployment.
As you conclude,
the last point is that youth unemployment.
As you conclude.
No stress. Youth unemployment is becoming a glaring problem, even for your professional qualifications. I mean, just this year alone, we're having about 320 newly qualified medical officers who are unemployed, which is a bit awkward, thinking that people always tell you that there's a certain amount of job security. So young people do have to think out of the box in terms of creating or seeking job opportunities in structures that speak to, or in places and sectors that speak to actually transforming society in an equitable way. And I think that the state of the nation was able to address this. The final point, and just my parting words, is that for the ANC, for government and its deployees to government, the talk is good, but it becomes meaningless if it's not met with the equal action and the political will to do these things vigorously. And it would be a disappointment if a year later we meet and we reflect on the things that government had said that they would do, that they've been unable to do so. As a part of active citizenry is us being able to hold government accountable each step of the way. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Doc, for something that we in the Youth League and in the ANC in general have been bemoaning for the longest time, and that's in regards to implementation. You know, we speak a lot, we have fantastic policy, but we see very little movement in terms of implementation, and hopefully this new year can bring about some from the YCL have joined us, so that I can give you an opportunity to share your reflections. Okay, I'm not getting any response from the YCL, so we'll move on. The national activist, Comrade Constantino Andre Jr., who is a member of the Central Committee of Frelimo, a chairman of the Fiscal Board of Frelimo Youth League, the deputy president of the National Youth Council of Mozambique, who holds a Master's in Science of Public Management. My apologies. Over to you, Comrade Constantino, to take us through.
Thank you, comrades. Good evening. First and foremost, I would like to send to all of you the most respectful greetings from the Frelimo Youth League on behalf of my Secretary General, Mr. Silva Livoni, who also sends you his greetings on behalf of President Philip Nyusi. So, comrades, I believe I was invited to share our views about the SONA, and so we will proceed. And differently, maybe from your expectations, I'll be here today to point out or to focus more on what is our role as youth leagues of ruling parties, as youth leagues of neighboring and partner parties as well. So more than pointing out on the SONA as itself, I will be sharing some of the ideas I think they can really be practical and support I mean the SONA and as well as the president. As you know, this is our main duty as youth leagues. So I will first focus on something that you pointed out very well, which is the skills development. And one of the greatest transformational opportunities on this is the innovation. So it does not make sense for me as a Mozambican to have or to need an expert and maybe someone from the US, someone from Europe come here and have a competitive advantage over my locals, and while South Africa is here is producing people every day. So what is the opportunity here? We don't have an integrated regional database of experts or a regional database of talents or people who can be shared along the region to also get the job opportunities that are available in the region, but also produce a positive impact in the region. So as you know, we have all the African continent with a lot of potentials, with a lot of resources, but it's difficult for us as Africans to get access to it. So what suggests is as well that we need to rethink and influence as youth leagues our ruling parties to reconsider the borders and the protocols to ease the trade and the interactions between people, but in a very structured way so that we can get or can extract the most beneficial resources from each other. One of the things the president was pointing out that 80% of the matriculants could defeat COVID-19. My question here and my challenge for the national for the National Youth League, or for the Youth League of the National African National Congress (ANC), is that you need to start questioning if you are graduating people who know what to do in the society, if you are graduating people who are solving problems, or you are graduating people just for the sake of graduating, because we have a lot of sectors with a lot of challenges. We are now facing an electricity crisis in South Africa, but how open is the room for those who can bring innovative solutions, or how open is the room for those who can apply their knowledge to bring some kind of positive change? For instance, the other thing that I would like to point out is the regional cooperation, collaboration, and coordination, so that we can mutually use our own resources. A good example is that a good and sad example is that South Africa now is facing electricity crisis, and Mozambique is facing floods. But we share the same rivers, we share the same resources, and it is something for us to question. Why don't we come together and bring a good investment for our hydropower, so that we can take advantages of what we have, and both of us we can share. South Africa is buying electricity from Mozambique, Kawarabasa, and of course we might not be exploring our full potential, so that maybe situations like these should not happen, not now, not even in a later future. One of the things that I really like to hear President Ramaphosa pointing out is the data-driven decision-making that he intends to use in order to tackle crime and corruption. Of course, there is a huge opportunity on this, that ANC Youth League has a big role to play. You need to be clusters of integrity in the society. You need to send this message out, so that people not only can be afraid of technologies, but people can be there to support all those data-driven and technologies that the president wants to put in place. But more than anything, we know that one of the drivers of the crime and corruption is the unemployment. Mainly crime itself, it's the unemployment. And one of the innovative solutions that you can maybe bring as an ANC Youth League is to create in each neighborhood an association of young people who can benefit from a specific funding to take advantage of their skills, so that they can be productive in the market. By the end of the day, you can have in each neighborhood at least 10 people, 20 people being employed directly, coming together to work in a collective action to produce a certain kind of impact. One of the other things that I think South Africa has to play right now as a role is to be a cluster for industrial transformation and industry. For instance, the president was pointing out the clothing and the textiles. Mozambique is one of the producers of cotton, but our cotton leaves Mozambique and goes to China, goes to India, goes to Malaysia. So what role can South Africa play? What role can the youth from South Africa play transforming South Africa as a cluster? Imagine if all the raw materials, apart from being exported to Europe and to other avenues, they are sent to South Africa. There are more jobs generated in both sides. And then maybe we can voice up in the world and start selling our products in a very fair and just manners, or with good prices. So the other things maybe I would like to point out is the sociology of consumption. We know that currently South Africa is producing, Mozambique is producing.
As you conclude, thank you.
Thank you. So is the sociology of consumption. Of course, we are facing crisis, electricity and economic, in many other sectors, but what are we producing and consuming from South Africa and from Africa and as a continent? We need to start reflecting on how much we value what we produce. For instance, someone was giving me an example one day. A maize produced in South Africa or in Mozambique is less cheaper than a candy produced in Europe. What nonsense is that? For what? Why can something that is taking so much time from our agricultural and our farmers to produce is less expensive than something that in seconds is produced in industry? So those are the ideas that maybe, of course, with time we can develop more, we can have other ideas, but the key message is let us come together, let us take good advantage of our relations to produce impact as young people, but also as Africans. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you so much, Comrade Constantino, for your reflections. We know as the ANC that we have very good relations with Frelimo, and hopefully that can extend to the Youth League in a deeper way. And the point that you make that the success of South Africa is inherently linked to the success of our neighbors, not only. So thank you for that. I'm now going to give an opportunity. We're about an hour into our program, so I'm going to give an opportunity to provinces to share their reflections. Fortunately or unfortunately, you're going to have less time than our previous speakers, so I'm going to limit you to 5 minutes each, and we'll start with the Eastern Cape. So if there's any representative from the Eastern Cape who would like to have a bite, just show your hand and I can note you. Okay, nobody from the Eastern Cape. We'll move swiftly on then to the Free State, who is represented by comrades Youth League Free State Chairperson, YCL National Member, a Kopanong local municipality in Jagersfontein. Over to you, leadership, to give us your reflections. Oh, sorry. I'm told that who is an ANC Free State PC member, the current senior manager for local economic development and tourism, a former Free State director of local economic development, a former branch chairperson of SASCO, and the Mail and Guardian Top 200 of 2017. Comrades, however you decide to use your time, you have 5 minutes for your.
Thank you very much, Program Director. My name is Nogutula from the ANC Youth League in the Free State. From the President's SONA, we have identified two aspects that we would like to speak about. The first being on employment. We appreciate the report from the President on the number of jobs that have been created, but we need to note that youth unemployment remains a crisis. And as we appreciate the policies and programs from our government, we need to emphasize that much of the focus is on the supply side, when the reality is that there are no vacancies in the economy that are waiting to be filled. And if the tax incentive to be announced by the Minister of Finance continues not to yield the expected results on job creation, and instead of it being used as a wasteful corporate welfare, it would need to be revised and part of its portion be redirected to more sustainable employment programs, extending beyond the expanded employment programs of the EPWP. And there must be a change in course as we chart a new path towards economic development until 2030 and beyond, where there should be a new macroeconomic policy framework that has a GDP growth rate target of at least 6% a year that is binding on both the National Treasury and the Reserve Bank, because with the objective of achieving a full employment. Because to date, you see that Treasury's primary focus seems to be on debt, and while the Reserve Bank is respectively focusing on inflation. So it needs to be binding to both these big stakeholders to say that it needs to at least focus on achieving full employment. And then we will then move to the dysfunctional municipalities that the president spoke about. And he said 163 out of 257 municipalities are considered dysfunctional. And from our provincial perspective, you would see that you would find that only one municipality is classified as low risk, while 11 are medium risk and 11 are high risk or dysfunctional. And government is implementing a number of interventions to address failures at local government level to improve service delivery. And in our province, 3 of our municipalities are under administration. And although we welcome government's intervention to place some dysfunctional municipalities under administration through your interventions such as Section 139, our view is that municipalities should be capacitated to avoid these sorts of interventions. And generally, it is communities that suffer the most when municipalities are dysfunctional. So on the other hand, municipalities expect that interventions will mainly help them with financial injection in order for them to offset their debts and other financial responsibilities. And we should note that there will always be a relationship between the socio-economic conditions of municipalities and their performance. And municipalities are expected to raise revenue in order to fund their operations, maintain infrastructure, and invest in development. So the high levels of poverty and unemployment shrink the revenue base of the municipality. And in this context, an expectation that each municipality must carry the cost of intervention is somewhat inconsistent with the foundational philosophy of the local government turnaround strategy, which calls for a differentiated approach to local government, and where the capacity of public representatives and officials need to be enhanced, and a more professional and public service should be a priority, where we will have skilled staff who are committed and ethical, so that we don't allow ourselves to get to a point where municipality actually needs these interventions that are not so much guaranteing that they are going to be a success. So it is also local government also remains the basic unit for visible economic development. And however, we see a problem in how the current local government functions do not enable it to make the maximum social and economic impact. And this is seen in how the implementation of local economic development process is centralized and assigned to a unit within the municipality, which rations transversing municipal interventions of local economic development, which results in the process being rigid and somewhat specialized, limiting the participation and integration of possible external support or inputs. And it is important to dismantle the traditional top-down approach in governance systems for our municipalities to be open to a participatory alternative approach where LED can become a necessary strategy and solution to tackle the rising triple challenges in our community. And in response to tackling these challenges, government must strictly regulate that municipalities should establish adequately coordinated institutional arrangements in order to achieve development targets, where the bottom-up approach will include all stakeholders in your community, your SMMEs, your business chambers and forums, so that these people are part of the policy and the levels of economic development ventures that they would want to see happening in their localities. And lastly, Chair, given the fact that not all young people can be absorbed into employment in both the public and private sector, we need to encourage them to become entrepreneurs and for them to have sustainable SMMEs. And however, in the pursuit of government creating an enabling environment through municipalities and departments, giving equipment and machinery to these SMMEs, government needs to regulate for these municipalities and sector departments to train the SMMEs and in turn allow them to be their primary sources when procuring services within their bandit, to say that you will be the people that will be on our tender. You'll be given a tender to provide services that the municipality and sector departments need. So for us to empower these young people through their SMMEs, it shouldn't just be us giving them machinery and equipment, but to actually use them to service our local government institutions and provincial governments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Noktula, for these issues relate directly to your communities. So I'm going to move quickly on to Gauteng. Do we have any representation from Gauteng who wants to perhaps give input? Okay, I'll take that as a no from Gauteng. We'll move then on to KZN by Comrade Bandile Mtholo, who holds a bachelor's BA honors in political science. He's also an ANC Youth KZN PTT member and a former ANC Youth League Richmond Ward 1 treasurer, a former South Secretary General, and a former SASCO KZN provincial chairperson, among a whole host of other credentials, which I won't go into too much detail now, Comrade Lwandile. I think your inputs are more important than your credentials for the. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Greetings to, as you have said that my name is Lwandile Mtholo. I think our analysis of the SONA is that it's to play the role of being an economic enabler to prosperity, because if you look at the issues that our programs and our programs that we speak of that ought to change government, there ought to be the motive forces of society that are galvanized to support that political program. There can never be a political program that is not supported by the masses. So as the ANC Youth League, we ought to galvanize society, we ought to speak to students, workers, ensuring that society does rally behind our programs. Because if you look at the president touching on the SMMEs, but if you look at the economy of the township economy, there's been a drastic reduction in terms of how that has been functioning. There hasn't been a care in terms of how the township economy is being controlled, policies that are being implemented, and at a local government level, and they ought to be given support by giving funding and skills. The working class has always survived on the basis that the labor theory of value tells you that the working class ought to, the industrial policies of South Africa ought to speak about, firstly, land. There ought to be land distribution towards the poor, toiling masses of South African community. Public procurements. You know, we can't, as the ANC Youth League, read that assets of the states are being sold off to private hands, because it's not a guarantee to anyone that if everything is privatized, it would then mean that it would be successful. If you look at the stock market now, you would understand that still on public procurement to procure goods and ensure that services, that essential services, are within the grasp of government, so that the government can be able to have control over it. Linkages with our other African countries, the expansions of our routes, trains and roads ought to connect us to the entire African continent, because we are in a strategic location and we have strategic partners in other African higher education. You know, every year it's the right to learn. You would see premiers bursaries, local government giving out bursaries, but they never really ask in terms of the missing middle. They never ask in terms of issues of postgraduate, because if you want to have a developmental state, you ought to invest in innovative research. And innovative research would come from your postgrad studies, and ensuring that you bring in about a new academic in South Africa, because you understand that in universities, academics are aging, they're old, and they no longer really resonance with society. Investment into the ICT sector. I think we ought to invest in the ICT sector. You know, the Competition Commission once said that it did a study that if you go to all developmental countries or developmental states, you compare us to India, Nigeria, we have the most expensive data prices. And the Competition Commission had given instructions. So we ought, as the ANC Youth League, to fight those struggles that the price of data in South Africa ought to be lowered, and support the Competition Commission and ensure that we put pressure as society so that data does not become as expensive as it is in this country. We ought, of course, to build the tourism economy. If you understand, after COVID, our tourism economy has taken a knock in that, and tourism is not only going into fancier places. People in the rural areas, they've got other tourist attractions that we could invest in and ensure that that tourism sector in the rural areas is also harnessed so that the local people are able to make a living. The issue of the energy crisis. You see, we ought to have we ought to look at uranium and nuclear and solar, wind, hydro, and have a vast.
As we conclude, Comrade Lwandile.
The economy is taking a serious knock when it comes to
I'm not sure if it's my network, comrades, or what it is exactly that's happening. But I was just indicating that Comrade Lwandile was to wrap up, but I hope that he did not take it as an indication for him to stop entirely. Comrade Lwandile, my apologies to you. But let us move on then. We are moving alphabetically through our provinces. So the next on the list is Limpopo. Do we have any provincial representation from Limpopo on the call with us? Anyone who'd like to take a bite? Okay, no one from Limpopo. Let's move on then to Mpumalanga. Anyone from Mpumalanga? Nobody from the Northern Cape? Nobody from the Northern Cape, from the Western Cape? No one from the Western Cape. Okay, I just want to check. We were meant to have a speaker from COSAS to give us an input as well. I see Comrade Tabiso Mawaso is on the call with us. Comrade Tabiso, if you could give us input from and reflections rather on the State of the Nation address from the perspective of COSAS, please.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to represent the Congress of South African Students. Let me first pass the apology of the Secretary General of the organization to the sitting. He was unfortunately unable to join the session at the last minute due to unforeseen circumstances, and he had to deploy me to stand in for him. And as such, he sends his apology to the sitting. The president in his State of the Nation address said a lot of good things, a lot of things that could drastically improve the material conditions of our people in the country. But however, if the budget speech that will be presented by the Minister of Finance is not progressive and is full of austerity measures, as we have seen in the previous years, the president runs a risk of actually proving right to those who are actually saying that the State of the Nation address has turned into a metric farewell where each and every year our politicians show up in nice makeup and dresses. And as such, we feel that it's important that before we can have a full discussion on some of these things that were said by the president in the SONA, we wait and hear the final the speech that will be made by the Minister of Finance in his budget speech, as it's going to guide the ability of government to deliver on some of these key promises that have been made by the president. We do welcome the move by government to broaden our electricity generation capacity by introducing independent power producers. But however, as the Congress of South African Students, we are concerned about the decision by government to allow independent power producers to sell electricity directly to households. We feel that this will end up harming Eskom's ability to generate revenue. And if Eskom is unable to revenue, it doesn't matter whether the government is able to bail it out and pay its 400 billion debt or not, because it won't be able to sustain its operations without proper revenue generation. And we have noted the brutality of capital in the past, where capital has colluded, where we saw banks, big banks in South Africa colluding to collapse the rand, and with the Steinhoff saga and many others that we can mention. And we fear that these independent power producers might one day collude against Eskom to run it to the ground to ensure that it's unable to generate revenue, as a way of trying to capture the state and ensure that they control our development as a country, as electricity dictates the pace of our development. And also it speaks to the security of our nation, this issue of electricity. So we feel that government needs to be careful on the issue of independent power producers. We also welcome the announcement by the president that the country will be looking at diversifying our electricity grid with the introduction of other renewable electricity sources. This is a welcomed move, but however, we need to take it slow. We need to take it at a pace that it will not harm our country's economy. We need to be careful of ensuring that we do not cost people their livelihoods and jobs in the process of moving to renewable energy. And we applaud the president in his acknowledgement that we need to take it at a pace that is sustainable to us as the people of South Africa. We are also concerned, we note the presentation that was made by the president on the number of jobs that have been created by the state and the private sector. Indeed, these are impressive figures, but however, these figures mean nothing if the bulk of those figures are made up of people who are holding temporary jobs that are going to be ending in a couple of months after the State of the Nation address. As such, we feel that when the president next time makes a presentation on the jobs that are created by government, he must make a clear distinction of those permanent jobs that have been created and temporary jobs, because of the fact that those who hold temporary jobs are as good as those who are waiting on the lines of unemployment. And we feel that the speech of the president could have touched on a number of things that it was not loud enough on, such as broadening access to higher education. It can't be that each and every year we see our matriculants passing in disproportionate in high numbers, but however, when the academic year begins, we find that most of these matriculants who finished matric in the previous year are sitting at home doing absolutely nothing, because of the fact that there isn't just enough space for access to institutions of higher learning. And there are a number of issues that we have noted from the president's presentation. There are a number of key and sound issues that were also made by the president that we believe could stand a good chance of making sure that we build a truly developmental state. And however, we want to caution, we want to speak to government and say to government, we do not necessarily have to provide businesses with incentives and grants only to ensure that they create employments. There are other ways of attracting businesses to our localities by making sure that we provide quality services to our people, by making sure that the roads in our townships, in our towns are accessible, by making sure that there is police stations in our communities. These are some of the things that business people look into before they can invest in any particular economy. These are some of the things that business people look into, the safety and security of their businesses, and whether people will be able to access their services with convenience. And as such, we need to take a keen interest in the state of our municipalities, as if most of our municipalities are crippled. It therefore means that we are unable to service our communities. And as such, it means that If there are no basic services in our communities are not attractive sites for businesses to invest in. This is another hindrance to job creation by the private sector, because the private sector feels that there are high levels of crime in our communities, because the private sector feels that our roads are not adequate for their customers, because the private sector feels that there are a number of issues such as the lack of access to water in certain areas in which they could be able to benefit, but however, they are not able to move into such areas because of the fact that there aren't proper services that are provided to our communities. So long as we are lacking in terms of service delivery, there is nothing that the government will do that will ensure that we create adequate jobs for our people. We need to make sure that our communities and these localities that we want businesses to invest in are worth investing in. I would like to end there on behalf of the Congress of South African Students. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Comrade Tabiso, for those important reflections. I think, you know, as a member of the ANC Youth League, one tends to be very caught up in political debate a lot of the time. And so it's quite refreshing for me personally to sit here and have this conversation around the economic development of our country and to hear the ideas of fellow youth leaguers and fellow young people from the Progressive Youth Alliance and even young people from across our borders. I think that the discussion was fruitful and the discussions have been particularly engaging in a way that I think there's a lot more space for within the ANC Youth League. But these conversations must happen at a level where we're able to turn these ideas that we have into some kind of implementable solutions. And so that we don't reflect the problems of our state, so that we can actually do something to create and generate employment for young people in this country, and so that young people in this country are able to live prosperous lives, because that is the promise at the end of the day of the ANC. So I don't want to take up a lot of time reflecting on what's been said, but I think there have been some salient points that have been made by panelists in that government needs to be more specific and in its interventions for young people, and that the interventions and the opportunities that young people that are made by government for young people are made more accessible, and that the jobs that are created are a lot more meaningful and sustainable, and that they're not temporary and transient. Government has taken quite a few steps in the right direction when it comes to gender-based violence and climate change, but there's still a lot more that we need to do, particularly around advocacy work within that space. When it comes to students, we know the issues around funding within the sector, and that the comprehensive student funding model needs to be finalized and needs to be implemented so that the missing middle, which make up 23% of the sector, according to the DSG of SASCO, are taken care of, because the bloating debt burden in the sector is only going to worsen the issues in the sector. Again, implementation. We have lots of good ideas, lots of fresh ideas, but unfortunately, it lacks in when it comes to implementing it, or rather our government lacks when it comes to implementing it. Again, to reiterate the point that we don't exist, South Africa doesn't exist in isolation, and it's very important that our neighboring countries are prospering as we are prospering, because our success is inherently linked to their success. The importance of the localization of the economy for development is also a salient point, I think, that was made. And that our leaders from SASCO really bemoan the issue of austerity and the measures that have been put in place over the past few years by the various finance ministers when it comes to our budget, and that those measures must be lifted in order to drive meaningful and purposeful economic development. I think those are a few very important points that we can take away from this discussion. So as I hand over to our gracious host, Comrade Insaf, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to moderate this panel. I want to say thank you to all the panelists for joining. I'd like to thank fellow young people for joining in, so that you can, hear and understand and be exposed to some of the ideas that are in this organization that we call our home. So back over to you, Comrade Insaf.
Shukran, Comrade Kamil, Inkosi, Baye Danki. It's been the beginning of, I think, a more pointed approach and an unapologetic approach by young people to plug into the national discourse and say that a recession not in our name. We need to be mindful when devoid of repeating the remarks that Comrade Kamil had mentioned. I think it's important that we appreciate that emerging markets are not going to wait for any single individual to be ready enough to enter that space, which is why it is very important for any individual looking to diversify their income generating capacity, whether as a job seeker, whether as a job creator, or as someone who holds employment and wants to add on a second, third, or however manyth stream of income to their earning capacity, is to appreciate that your social capital actually matters. For many business moguls across the world, they weren't experts in their area of industry now. They weren't academically interested sometimes in the kinds of business ventures that they were able to make hugely successful, particularly in areas such as emerging markets, which South Africa has an opportunity to participate in. And should we not, as young people, make the sober-minded decision to ensure that we are informed, make sure that we are networking with the kinds of people who can provide us with mentorship and facilitate the kinds of opportunities to enter those markets. Those markets will certainly develop without us. And we are here to try and encourage everyone to take a moment to reflect and take seriously the opportunity available to us. We need to shy away from being the reactionary expert critiques that we are and try and take the plunge and participate in these markets. It was the mining indaba held in Cape Town, and there are huge opportunities available to young people that the state has provided. If you do not know about those opportunities, let me assure you that the ANC Youth League will be making its business to ensure that those opportunities are understood, are workshopped, and that facilities or opportunities are facilitated to access those opportunities. This is one of many events that the ANC Youth League's National Economic Development Subcommittee that I chair will be hosting to ensure that we aren't going to watch the opportunities pass us by. And insofar as how all of this ties into the SONA 2023 address, we say again, a recession not in our name. We do not accept, as the ANC Youth League, a leadership that will usher in more often than not these terrible two words that give us chills on our spine, and that is national crises. And we appreciate, as the ANC Youth League, that there's a broader context and layers to the complexity that the ruling party needs to navigate. And some of these issues are consequential, they are structural. They are structural if analyzed in the detailed manner that it ought to be analyzed. And so tonight, we say thank you for spending some time to share and embrace with us. We will be taking note of the comments, the questions across our social media, and looking forward to ensuring that the kinds of investment in the ANC Youth League as a preparatory school of the ANC will lead to the kinds of savvy commentary that is mindful of our trade balances across the world, ensure that the kinds of analysis and critique and direction that the ANC Youth League and broadly across the MDM structures are able to provide can ensure that there are pointed recommendations that ensures that our relations across the BRICS region is solidified, and that emerging markets, for example, in the MENA region is something that we can explore. And so we appreciate the time and effort that each and every panelist has put into this evening. We look forward to embracing the growth as we provide the kinds of capacitating that is necessary to ensure South Africa doesn't find itself wanting on the periphery of the global discourse when it comes to navigating the geopolitical climate that is so uncertain and many would say unprecedented. And as we refuse the opportunity to pass us by, please do take a moment to like, to share, to engage with us about what you find agreeable and that which you find disagreeable, because we do not shy away from reconciling tensions and reasoning, and most certainly look forward to taking further these engagements. To our international guest, thank you so very much for bringing your voice to our airwaves, even though the Internet of Things isn't as separated as continents and countries might be. And to the ANC head office, thank you very much for allowing us the opportunity to collaborate so seamlessly. It indeed has been an affirmation for me, for the ANC Youth League's National Economic Development Subcommittee, and broadly speaking, the ANC Youth League. We most certainly are looking forward to participating in the discourse in shaping the foreseeable master plans, cross-sectoral, and participating in cross-sectoral engagement. And thank you once again for being here this evening. My name is Insaf Ayana Isaacs, Chair of the ANC Youth League's National Economic Development Subcommittee. And perhaps next time I should put myself on the panel and make sure that these pointed suggestions that I keep alluding to are outlined in pragmatic terms. And our parting shot this evening is to say that education is not a death sentence, and actually shouldn't be a death sentence. We can see from the lessons in the Americas how catastrophic that can be. And as people who are guided by the National Democratic Revolution, we ought to be mindful of our ideological responsibilities in ensuring that the working class, the emerging middle class, the missing middle are managed in a way that is not patronizing, and that is managed in a way that is developmental. And we are convinced that those opportunities do exist, going by the case studies that we have studied. But more on that, please follow the ANC Youth League social media. We are bringing into the fold concepts such as masterclasses. We are going back to basics by revisiting our tools of analysis as the ANC Youth League's leadership. And we are going to open up the space to people who are interested in being part of the future of South Africa, of Africa and the world. We are well aware of the resources that we have available to ourselves as a continent, and we are not going to be bullied any longer. And to ensure that we will not be bullied and found wanting as the keeper of resources that this world actually needs, we know very well that we need to capacitate ourselves, and that's precisely what we are going to do. As we know, there will be pronouncements from finance in South Africa about how austerity measures will be balanced according to accounting principles and it's as the national balance sheet of South Africa. And we are hopeful that the kind of ideological underpinnings articulated in the National Democratic Revolution will be seen there. And it should be so flippant that no one needs to point it out. And that being said, thank you once again, everyone. It's going to be a lot more exciting for the foreseeable future. And it's the nature of politics. It's not for everyone, but I'm sure there is something for everyone. So if economics is something that you're interested in, particularly microeconomics, which is an area of interest for myself, please be sure to reach out to the ANC Youth League via its social media. At some point, it will reach the Economic Development Subcommittee, and we can have a chat about ways in which that we can synergize ideas, identify the quick wins, and where things are agreeable, deliberate. Thank you once again for your time. We would like to call this post-SONA exclusive reflection to a close. Thank you so much. Good night further. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Good night.